Would you be able to explain and talk about your article you wrote on egregores and high beings and high agencies?
Sure. Yeah. All right. I was the co-author of two articles for the Symbolic World blog with my friend Daniel Townhead. And he and I were attempting to do a deep dive into this concept because we thought that there were potentially some holes and maybe even missteps in the way that the conversation had developed up until that point. Not that we have any particular credentials to be offering correctives to the prevailing viewpoints in this space, but just we wanted to find some way to contribute to the conversation, and we hoped that it would lead to just having the subject develop into more uh, fruitful places, I guess you could say. Um, and so in the article, we were first trying to arrive at a suitable definition of the word egregore. I find that everyone sort of has their own unique interpretation of this word, um, and it has some roots that I don't think are very often addressed in the contemporary conversation around these topics. Uh, Particularly like in the area of the occult and the esoteric, right? Like the word egregore actually arose in that kind of a landscape, um, where people were using it to refer to concrete spiritual entities, right? Very like particularly man-made, like human created concrete spiritual entities. Right now, we don't have to get into exactly what that means at this moment, but that's kind of the historical foundation for the word egregore itself. Now, that concept started to, kind of got picked up by folks like Jordan Hall. I started to hear John Vervaeke using the word. Jonathan Pajot. I don't think Jonathan. I think Jonathan kind of reluctantly entered that conversation. Um, I'm not sure if he was the first, or he would have been the first to adopt that word for the kinds of things that he's talking about. But he was having conversations with folks who were using the term, and he was happy to discuss it. But they were using it more in reference to collective social phenomena, and finding a way to make sense of the apparent agency and unity of what's being called distributed cognition, right? Like amongst these um, large scale social structures. What is it that's directing people and canalizing them into the same kind of mindset, right? When they're operating within these spaces. Um, so, to my mind, that's a related but not entirely synonymous thing to what the 19th century esotericists who coined the term were talking about.
Hmm.
So we explore that a little bit in our article. We talk about the occult and esoteric context out of which the term arose. We talk a little bit about the sort of analogous concept that one finds in Tibetan Buddhism, um, with this concept of the tulpa, right, which is a sort of again, it's a human created spiritual entity that one produces out of one's own spiritual activity for the sole purpose of confronting like a demonic entity. It's kind of like
Mm-mm.
an ordeal that the spiritual aspirer puts themselves through, right, to learn a kind of lesson. Um, so that's a
So,
very different thing. The third element of this article was Daniel and I were trying to find a way to frame this subject such that it would make sense to Jonathan Pajot's symbolic world audience, right? Which consists. I don't have the data to back this up, but which I would assume consists largely of young adults either interested in Orthodox Christianity or um, practicing Orthodox Christianity, um, or are involved in some other flavor of Christianity, right? So there's a whole very, very complicated history of how this same exact subject, the subject of higher beings, has been treated in the patristic literature, right? And there's a whole way that is considered even appropriate to speak about these things within a church context. And so we had to try to find a way to bring these two disparate modes of viewing this subject in line with something that would make sense to you know, Orthodox Christians, either lowercase or uppercase O.
Hmm. So can I just summarize what I'm hearing here? It's interesting. So you know, the term egregore specifically, it kind of comes from a specific spiritual kind of entity. But then it's really fascinating because you have people like scientists like John Vervaeke kind of wanting to use the term, or simply because then you have distributed cognition in like companies and economies, and just like or just crowds. Like how do we start having language to speak about sort of distributed entities in the world that are beyond um any one individual, and then like the term kind of becomes helpful. But then equally, given that it has the roots of, it kind of means like specific one spiritual entity, like okay, then let's think kind of in terms of spiritual language. How might, like a Christian in Jonathan Peugeot's way of thinking, how would they actually kind of square that? And then it kind of they could then kind of collides the kind of just talking about something scientifically, like how are we supposed to think about these collective agencies, versus also then what kind of identity, what kind of spiritual identity do these kinds of things actually um, have, So um, in trying to bridge then and understand what we mean by these kinds of group collective entities, um, how would you try and think about them?
Sorry, I think my I think my internet froze up there for a second.
Okay. Uh, how would you try and, going from that position, then setting up the problem, how would you then try and think about these high agencies? What do you talk about in the article?
Yeah, so well, one of the problems that I see figures like Jonathan Pajot and Jordan Hall and John Vervaeke attempting to approach using these concepts is what makes a collective entity cohere as a unit, right? So that's one issue. The second issue is what's the relationship between that phenomenon and consciousness? I think the consciousness part is really where um, there seems to be a gray area and where I see people falling into certain traps. There's one of the things that we explore in the article that my friend Daniel and I perceive to be somewhat of a misstep is this willingness to attribute consciousness to a collective entity simply by virtue of the fact that it has a common identity, right? Those two things, to my mind, aren't synonymous, and so that's one of the issues that we explored in the article. Um,
Can I?
to give a concrete
Yeah.
example, it's like there's I've I don't want to poke fun at anything that's been said in this space, but like I kind of made a joking reference in another conversation that I had on another podcast about the conversation Jonathan had. I believe it was with Jordan Hall about like the potential consciousness of a basketball team, right? I think that that's to be completely frank. I think that that's a kind of a preposterous notion to even consider that something like a basketball team uh, would be conscious. I appreciate the fact that I appreciate the willingness to explore you know any possibility, but to my mind, that's there's a conflation of two separate concepts going on in such an assessment. Um, it's just because there is a unified identity within a group of human beings cooperating, doesn't mean that there's some sort of higher consciousness involved necessarily. If there is, there's a fundamental difference between where that higher consciousness is located, so to speak, um, in something like a human being or an ensouled organism, and something like a team, right? Even if we were to attribute a consciousness, an awareness, an agency to the basketball team, is the agency here on Earth in the basketball team? Like, does the basketball team embody a unified locus of experience in the same way that, say, a human being or even a dog or a cat does? Right?
Right.
There's when the cells of the human body or of an animal organism come together to participate in the unified entity that is the creature, the ensouled creature, well, those parts are in service of an an organism that's incarnated here on Earth, whose consciousness is here on Earth, and is directing the movements of that unified entity, right? It's like I would
Mm.
hesitate to say that something similar is happening with a basketball team. So the question becomes, okay, if there is a higher being involved, like where is it, so to speak? I know that that's probably like a somewhat of a fraught way to put the question, but I think it makes sense. Is
Mm.
is ever does every collective entity, social or otherwise, have some kind of a unified locus of experience residing within it in the same way that we see in an ensouled creature, right? That was really the main thrust of the two articles that we wrote, were like exploring all of the different ramifications of that particular issue.
And because it that makes a lot of sense of like there could definitely be some kind of experience or agency, but then it's definitely a different kind of thing to the kind of consciousness we have. So it's like let's try and think about and explore what kind of thing that is. But like let's, I mean, we can try and do that now then and try and think about, yeah, what kind of like identity, what kind of thing art is, like, yeah, some kind of team, a nation, I don't know, a company, like how should we think about these things, and they might be helpful then, because you talked about with humans, our identity, like the thing that gives us consciousness, agency, is like right here with us, like it's something incarnate, it's all together, um and like from a spiritual perspective, like I can see that it might then make sense to think about like a spirit, a soul, like that's kind of like very personal, like it's, and so, um but how should we think about the identity of something then, like a
Hmm.
kind of team? It's yeah, it's because something's there, but like it's kind of vaguer.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to zero in on the word person that you used. I think the nature of personhood is one element in this entire equation that often goes overlooked and unexplored. I haven't really heard many of these conversations venture into that area, right? Where people are really taking into consideration what it means to be a person, how that relates to incarnated experience. Um, you can look at it. I mean, if you, one, perhaps one inroad into the subject is to explore the different ways in which personhood connects to human beings and animals, and perhaps even plants and minerals, right? So, human beings, from a theological perspective, are persons, right? Animals are not. So there's something fundamentally different in the way that the spiritual world relates to the incarnated human being and the incarnated animal creature, right? And it's the fact that every single human being is a unique, a completely unique entity unto him or herself, whereas the animal is more of a generic entity, right? The the animal has no I. The animal doesn't say I to itself, right? We might sometimes it seems that the animal says I to him or her, to itself, but in those cases, it's usually something like a reflection of our own personhood that we see within the creature. Um, if you think about a wolf or a pig or a squirrel, the wolf or the pig or the squirrel simply carries out the species level actions that are common to the entire species, right? So it doesn't it doesn't have a component of its soul makeup that allows it to break from those completely species level functions, right? So again, in a sense, it's a generic entity. An individual wolf doesn't have a biography. It's just an instantiation of wolf, right? It runs the wolf script. And so but a human being has the potential to be truly creative and to divert from those elements which constitute its sheer nature, right? So a human being is not um, a slave to the constraints of the species. I can choose to counteract the constraints of the species if I want to, right? I can live my life in such a way that it's completely out of sync with the species. That would probably be a bad way to express my personhood. A good way to express my personhood would probably be to cultivate virtue, right, in order to counteract the uh, push and pull of my every wish and whim. So I can train my virtue to to render me calm in the face of adversity, whereas an animal just freaks out, right? Like an animal just does the animal thing according to the animal script in a given circumstance. So that's one way to look at like at the difference uh, between
Yeah.
human beings and animals in terms of personhood. But to kind of loop in the Christian spiritual perspective, there's a sense in which, and this comes up in these conversations with folks like Peugeot. There is a certain Christian perspective that says that every single entity, every kind of entity on Earth, has a sort of a foundation in the spiritual world, right? Has an angel assigned to it. A human being has a guardian angel. Every unique individual, because they are a person, is assigned a unique guardian angel. Whereas for animals, they have like the angel of the species, something like that. To bring this into the domain of collective social structures, in the Bible, we find references to the angel of a particular town, of a particular church, of a particular nation, right? We have guardian angels of these collective entities. So, in a sense, you can see these angels as sort of the ideal foundation in the spiritual world for the instantiated entities in the physical plane. And so in a sense it's like what's what's causing the animal to do what it does. Well, like what moves an owl? Well, the great owl moves the owl, right? And the great owl is in a sense related in some mysterious way that may or may not be uh, pious to investigate, to the angel of the owl species itself, right? So if one were to locate the some kind of a person in that entire milieu, it would be in the spiritual world. So if like do you see what I'm
Mm.
saying? It's like the angel of the fox is the person uh, when it comes to the fox. The person is not located in the individual fox. But with a human being, it's entirely different because the human being is the person, right?
Mm.
That's one way to look at it. That's this is my interpretation of of a bunch of different thinkers, including uh, this Russian Orthodox theologian Sergei Bulgakov. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. Uh, Rudolf Steiner is another thinker that I draw on heavily for these kinds of ideas. Um,
Yeah,
Valentin Tomberg. This might be a little of a bit of an idiosyncratic way to describe these things, but hopefully it provides some inroad into the question of personhood.
no, I think it's definitely helpful because again, if um like I know in Christianity, we can often thinks about humans as kind of the center of reality. So it's not like the highest, but it's just again you could think about the center as like it's where kind of like our angels, so to speak, or like the way in which the spiritual and the physical kind of touch, right? So like we're very like and the personhood is sort of there. Whereas like if you wanted to talk about the personhood, so to speak, of an animal, it's like maybe you could try and say it, but again, you'd have to kind of go like higher out. Like there's a kind of essence to the animal, but you can't locate it in any one animal. It's kind of it's only like it's too kind of unconscious there. But you could go higher up, and maybe, as you say, there's an angel of the species, and so it would be interesting and helpful, right? If we think about then humans, then we go lower to like animals, but then like also higher in some way. Like, okay, then what about groups of humans? Like, I've heard it said that perhaps there's some kind of angel form, like anytime multiple people come together, like if there is some kind of collective pattern and spirit to governing like the way people are interacting. Um, and I guess it would just be helpful then maybe like trying to think about what we mean by an angel or like a spirit here. Because one thing that comes to mind for me is like Carl Jung and the kind of like a higher self, or like Corban's divine double.
Hmm.
Like it's like almost in that, I guess for them it's almost like let's not even almost not talk about spiritual domain, but like psychologically, like for Carl Jung, the soul image, the anima, the animus, it's actually something that um we can like strive towards, or it helps pull us towards our higher self. And then like you could say like something like, is that higher self a thing? Like
Hmm.
because it's not not really, because at least in like the physical world it's something we're striving towards to attain, so it's kind of an image. But like um it also kind of like that's kind of maybe like something where Carl Jung would stand his ground. Like, no, it is like he believes there is a kind of teleology, like a purpose, and we're trying to. It's the purpose of every individual to individuate and get to that
Hmm.
soul, like to the higher self, so to speak. Um, and and then that makes me just think, yeah, for people, for persons like that, like that's something we can actively strive to attain. And like as you said, like for humans, we could we could actively like we could fall prey to our animal instincts and things, right? And like fail to achieve that ideal. Whereas I don't really see how an animal could kind of fail to be to fail its animalness. Like can it like you could
It
fail
can. No,
to
animals don't have that kind of freedom, right? They can't be
mm,
held responsible for their actions because they just carry out the dictates of the species.
mm, mm.
That's why
um
you can't get mad at an animal.
yeah,
You
and I
can't take an
mean
animal to court.
yeah, and that's the way we treat them, and like, and if you just think about persons and own individual lives as well, like you have to deal with like the idiosyncrasies, the very specifics of people. Although then again, maybe animals, maybe if like if from their like perspective, maybe they really know specifically other animals and they can locate, oh, hey, that's that animal, they have names to them, maybe they do, I don't know. But okay, like they're putting that aside, I mean, you can kind of see some essence to what we're saying, like kind of makes sense. Um so then how should we think about angels, these kinds of spirits in like higher collective entities?
Hmm. So, well, you mentioned Carl Jung, so I want to touch on that because I think that could possibly serve as a bridge back into egregores. You also mentioned the higher self, which I think is related. So maybe I'll first touch on the higher self and try to build a bridge to Carl Jung. Somewhere along that trajectory, we'll touch on angels and then maybe get back to egregores. So the higher self, yeah, I mean, you do see this concept come up in a lot of different places. Um, as you're saying, Carl Jung has his own conception of the higher self. Corbin also. This is a pretty common concept. Um, I I think any exploration into the exact nature of what the higher self is bound to be conjectural to an extent. Um, so I think anyone listening to this should probably take whatever we say with a grain of salt. But the way that I personally view the higher self is that you have an instantiated consciousness and personhood here on planet Earth, right here as an incarnated earthly being. And then you have a divine prototype for, like who you are in the eyes of the creator, right? The divine plan for you as a person, which includes the freedom for you to act how you would like, right? Um, so it's not a fixed, the divine prototype for a human being isn't some sort of fixed uh, automaton, right? The God doesn't want you to be a puppet. Um, and then you have a guardian angel assigned to you. And again, this is just this is what I think. I'm telling you what I think right now. And it's I think you'll find it probably somewhat in line with Christian tradition, and there might be certain places where I'm um, perhaps unwittingly departing from that foundation. Um, so your higher self is something that your guardian angel assists you in aspiring to, right? The guardian angel, to reference Bulgakov again. Bulgakov actually claims that the guardian angel itself is the higher self. The guardian angel is the divine prototype for you and beckons you over the course of your life to fall into lockstep with him, right? With, well, I hesitate to say him because our angels uh, gendered. I think not, but the so there's this divine prototype that's actively uh, enticing you to live up to your full divine potential, right? I see it maybe a little bit differently. I think the higher self is probably not identical with the guardian angel, but the guardian angel is a being that helps you achieve the divine plan for yourself, right? And from a Christian standpoint, that would involve being part of the church, right? Uh, to a Catholic or Orthodox person receiving communion. So do good works, obviously, cultivating virtue. So that's what it means to live up to the divine prototype of oneself. Um,
That that they're kind of like, because I brought up Carl Jung, and like it's interesting that you also, like, from your perspective and your readings, think that there is this tension of, yeah, is the higher self identical with an angel that brings you to that higher self, or like is it kind of separate? And like, I guess, yeah, it just makes me think of Carl Jung again, and it's like the soul image is like the conscious sexual soul image is like something which helps us get to that higher self, but it's like one path, part of the unconscious, that brings
mm,
us to us. So that it is like a guiding figure. It's um um so and it is into the opposite sex of us, like for males, then it would be like a female. It is kind of an angelic like figure, like guiding us. um and but again, I don't want to say that's identical. There might even be an imperfect mapping, like that's and it's weird, like, because Carl Jung kind of almost avoids metaphysics, like, and doesn't say, like, I don't know, he's like, I'm not going to claim whether like this is real or what, even like what that means, but like psychologically, I can just see empirically, like, this is what happens. I see it in people's dreams. Like, this is a kind of a true phenomena. So
right.
like that's why he thinks psychologically, whatever, like we can say about these kinds of things. But again, it gets to the question of like trying to think about consciousness in uh like of higher beings, or like what kind of spiritual agencies govern them, because um like yeah, is it just like a psychological story, like from a bottom up? I'm almost thinking like you could look at like social psychologists that I've talked to and go, yeah, I mean, obviously there's these really complex dynamics in crowds and it can't be explained by the parts. Fair enough. But then I think, like, from your perspective and hearing you speak, we want a kind of emergence and emanation, right? So we also like that, like um in a kind of platonic sense, yeah, we have like a kind of form, like for us there's like a kind of a prototype in heaven, so to speak, as you would say, like that we're striving to, that God has a plan for us. And then the thing is that it's weird, because if we, like, as humans, create like a basketball team or a corporation, we it's like, we create these man-made things, right? On the one hand, this to bring it back to the start of the conversation, you could say this is an egregore, like a spiritual thing we created, But on the other hand, like, can humans create spiritual beings? What does that even mean? Doesn't
Mm-hmm.
but then, like, does God have a plan for like the basketball team that we created?
Mm.
Also, no. So
Yeah,
this is
that's
the
a
kind
good
of the
question.
tension.
That's what I mean. We asked that question directly in the articles that you referenced earlier. Um, what's God's plan for the New York Stock Exchange? That's the
Right.
like the direct example that we used. So all right, I think now would be a good time to talk about Jung and see if we can build a bridge to egregores in that way. So, like you said, Jung deliberately avoids metaphysics, even though his even though his project was really, by all accounts, a metaphysical one. Right? He's building a metaphysics from psychological starting points, refusing to make any hard and fast metaphysical claims, but I guess approaching it from a phenomenological perspective of this is what we find in the psyche. Right? Um, I don't think that the anima, the contrasexual soul image, is analogous to the guardian angel. I've heard that argued before. I don't think it entirely maps. What Jung is trying to do is he's trying to build a map of the entire entire psyche of the human person. So the self in Jungian terms includes all sorts of entities that are not within the conscious apprehension of the waking conscious state, right? So there's all sorts of stuff happening within the psyche that's unknown to consciousness, that's unknown to the eye, which what Jung would call the ego, right? So there are all these many layers of dynamics that are interacting both between themselves and with the eye and with the world. And this is sort of the psychic periphery, if you will, of the human being. And there's a certain sense in which that psychic periphery at a certain point opens up to a completely objective domain that is common to all human beings. And that's what Jung referred to as the collective unconscious, right? I see no problem with any of that. I think Jung's work in that uh, regard was groundbreaking and phenomenal, and holds to this day. Um, he had an idiosyncratic way of approaching it, right? I mean, he's approaching it as a scientist. He's coining terminology to refer to these things that he's kind of finding within the psyche. But I think he's referring to real things, and he's just creating his own language to describe something that really does exist. And I think, to my mind, what it calls to attention is that there is a kind of intermediate domain between the physical and the spiritual. It's the soul world, right? The psyche. The psyche is a thing unto itself in a certain sense. The psyche is not. The psyche is subjective. It pertains to the individual. But at a certain point, if we were to go higher up, so to speak, keep climbing higher up, one finds that domain kind of merges into another domain, which is itself eternal and immutable. Um, and so that's where we come. That's where we brush up against things like angels, right? The angels are, one way to think about it is that these are spiritual persons, non corporeal persons, uh, kind of one step below the Godhead, right? One step below the eternal. Angels aren't eternal themselves, but they're like in traditional Christian angelology. They're sort of what can be called ev eternal, right? They're um, kind of one step in between being eternal and being corruptible. Uh, but they are immortal, right? So you've got this domain of subjective, personal, psychic content, which then funnels up into a more strictly objective domain of entities that have uh, uh, their own autonomy, separate from your personal consciousness, right?
Yeah, I really like that you would think about the almost continuity between mind and psyche compared to like a spiritual domain, and because like okay, it's helpful to think of them as separate, but then equally, like say for Carl Jung, it's like actually like the psyche is very individualized and are unconscious until like somewhere deep down. You think about like things that are so deeply evolved that they kind of go across species, across people. Then it's like actually like there's like look at it for him. It's like it's if you could have just have a description in terms of genes or anything, but actually for him it's actually some kind of ground of just reality more broadly, mind that everyone can access. Like because when you say that the link between the psyche and the spiritual, it makes me think of um the way Jordan Peterson often kind of talks about like personalities or emotions, like anger or something. And he goes, on the one hand, you can say this is like a very, it's a very idiosyncratic emotion that you're having. It's biologically evolved, this and that. But then equally, everyone can experience anger. And the funny thing about something like anger is we can experience anger, and then we can go, oh, I feel so bad. I just did that thing. That wasn't me. Ugh, like I can't believe I just did that thing. And then it was so it's like some kind of force, some kind of drive was
Hmm.
just flowing through you. And so like it was partly you, but then partly these unconscious things, and like that's probably like in general how like psychic life is like. It's we think we're ego, the star of the show, but no, actually like often unconscious forces are going through us, helping us see the world, helping us act. And but there is like in times of anger, say, where like actually a force can kind of overwhelm us to a degree, right? And it's like forcing us to act almost beyond what we think we are. And there's this clash between us and the unconscious. And then it's something that then Jordan Peterson will then kind of argue like something like this almost. If you can kind of because if I feel angry, anger, this deep anger, say, in a scenario like it's personalized to me. But if you can distill what anger is between loads of different individuals, right? So like distill the essence of anger across loads of individuals, and like and then like that if you try and distill it, like that's not a thing, because like in a way anger has to be something embodied. Like I don't know what it means for like non-person kind of to be angry. It's sort of about, I always think you need like almost like John Vervaeke's relevance realization. It needs to be about something. It needs to be like I'm angry because I haven't fulfilled a need and whatever. But nevertheless, like then Jordan Peterson might go like, are you saying anger is then not real, or like maybe it's
Hmm.
like incredibly real, right? Because it does the essence of anger, it pervades like beyond like it's a force, a personality that can go across loads of different entities. And then you might say something like, well, then is that not like thinking about that spirit, the essence of anger personified, as something like the god Ares or something, acting within individuals? Like, also, it's even Jordan Peterson will say this and go, yeah, I don't know what that would mean. Like, that's a weird way to think about it. But nevertheless, is that potentially useful to think about? The god of war or something, like the god of anger, actually like um something again in the kind of eternal realm that's like if you were to keep pushing beyond the psychic, can you get to something like that?
That's an extremely interesting and relevant question. I I lean toward the opinion that yes, there is something like the god of anger, right? Um, but the question is, how do we classify such a thing? Um, is it on par with the angels? Good question. I think this is potentially where someone like Rudolf Steiner can be quite helpful. Um, Steiner divided the human being into four discrete ontological domains that all have to be apprehended on their own terms. Um, and they derive from Aristotle's uh, four soul classifications of the physical body, the nutritive soul, the sensitive soul, and the intellectual soul. Steiner develops those kind of through a Goethean lens, meaning like in reference to um, utilizing the work of Goethe, right? He takes those soul concepts and concretizes them even further. And by concretize, what I mean is that he, again, claims that these levels of reality have to be apprehended on their own terms. They're non-reducible to each other. So the domain of the physical is the lowest, right? And it doesn't engender the further domains which rest atop it. The nutritive domain, what Steiner very esoterically calls the etheric domain, the 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 life world, the elemental world, is a realm of is an ontological domain unto itself, right? One step up from, and that's the domain at which life processes occur, the morphological changing of form, and the permanence, the semi-permanence of form within the physical domain, that's integrally bound up with what we know of as life. That's the etheric or the nutritive domain. One step up from that, this is where we meet the animals, and this is where we have what's called the astral domain. Again, very esoteric, but there's reasons for why that terminology is used. But basically, the astral domain is the domain that we have in common with animals, right? This is the domain of the drives and the passions and the emotions. That's where things like anger reside. Um, and then one step further, we get into the domain of Aristotle's intellectual soul, or what Steiner and a lot of the German idealists and even 20th century personalists would refer to as the I, right? And so the I, that's that level of reality that human beings have in common with incorporeal entities like angels, but which uh, creatures like animals and plants don't have, right? So there's so if we highlight the astral domain for a moment, we there's a sense in which again we have to approach that realm of being in its own terms. Like Jordan Peterson is saying, that anger does not reduce to matter, right? There's no, like, you can try to make that mapping if you want to, but it does you absolutely no good. It's like trying to describe a, I don't know, trying to describe a backflip that someone does on a bike by referencing the atoms like in the bike. It just doesn't. It that's probably a bad example because those are
Yeah,
still
it's
within the
not a
physical domain. But
yeah, it's not a useful level of analysis, and like you can get to and you don't we don't have to get to like philosophical debates of, I mean, like, could you then explain everything through emergence from like the physical? But like that's something that I've heard him a lot in recent debates is anytime you like try and explain something, like for example, like I remember talking to Jean-Philippe Marceau, and we had this discussion of like should if I, can we explain the reason why I'm talking to you on this podcast, Jean-Philippe? And it's like, you could say, oh, because God intended it, and it's like kind of true but also not like a relevant way of thinking about it. And so then it's like, if, as I've been saying, like anger has like some sort of hold over you and it's like this thing in of itself, even if like there was one way you could spin things such that you like only look at like the atoms, like you could try and do that, but it's not very helpful
right,
explaining anything. Yeah.
right. Well, and not only is it not helpful, but it's just not the fact of the matter. The fact of the matter is that passions and drives and emotions, they simply do exist on a separate level of reality than material processes. Full stop. Period. There's just no there. Again, like you're saying, you could debate philosophically if one emerges from the other, but there's really no point in even going there. So in the same way in which the individual components of the physical body are taken from the broader physical environment outside of the creature, there are emotions and drives and passions that assemble into a kind of body, to use that term loosely, uh, for the individual creature. So you, in a certain sense, have a body that's made up of the passions, drives, emotions, sympathies, and antipathies that you are constellating around yourself at any given moment or slice of time, right? That's what Steiner would refer to as the astral body. So again, sounds very esoteric, and in a certain sense, it is quite esoteric. But thinking about it matter of factly, you, in a certain sense, just have a collection of emotions that's proper to you yourself, right? So, in a certain sense, there is. Uh, if I wanted to point to that constellation of entities surrounding you, I could do it in such a way that I'm referring to an objective phenomenon, right? So it's subjective to your internal experience, but I can still point to it and describe it objectively in a certain sense. So there is a way that we can kind of objectively refer to the contents of the psyche. Like so does that make sense?
Yes, the way I would make, yeah, the way that like what sounds to me is like what John Vervaeke uses the term transjective of like in because like, for him like everything is kind of relational. So like yeah, like anger, emotions, passions, or the way we act as an agent that we can work. Like nothing is like true in some objective sense, but it is true that the way I see the world depends on like whether I'm thirsty and I'll water will be relevant and this and that. And so like it's like you could from the outside you can point and be like it's objective that that is driving the reciprocal relation between like the agent you're seeing and then like its world. So in that sense, like just because it's not like a physical thing, I don't see how he like for him like well he doesn't hold to like a purely like reductionist ontology,
Mhm.
right? So it's relational, and then in that sense it makes a lot of sense like that. So then pointing to that thing that seems very real. Um,
It does, and here's where egregores come back in. So if we were to utilize that concept of the astral body to get back to the sort of occult foundations of the word, the way that people were originally thinking of egregore is as one of those astral bodies. It's a an astral body created through the intentional or unintentional collective efforts of a collection of human beings that has, in a sense, a kind of objective existence that makes things happen, right? So when we are creating these human social structures, they have a coherence to them. They even have like that we there is a certain sense in which they have something beyond the astral. They have a and forgive me if using that terminology is still a bit esoteric and not quite landing, but hopefully you'll humor me for the moment. Um, there is a certain sense in which these entities, like the New York Stock Exchange, they have a logos, right? They've got a something higher than the simply astral about them. But whatever that thing is kind of being occluded or it's being relegated to the background. It's not shining through entirely. It's almost as if these astral entities are stealing the uh, spiritual foundations for what they're supposed to be and running away with them in a way that their true nature and their true purpose is not manifesting in the real world. And so we could say, and this is the argument that Daniel and I came to in our two essays. We ended up settling on egregores as a kind of headless being because it's referring back to some kind of an ideal divine, however you want to describe it, spiritual, purely spiritual prototype, but it's being engendered in such a way that through this kind of very turbulent and irrational emotional kind of an underpinning, right? That the whatever the logos is not shining through. And so that was our attempt to synthesize the original occult usage of the term egregore with something that would be more in line with Jonathan Pajot's orthodox leaning audience, right?
right. Yeah, that you kind of create like a spiritual kind of monster. Like it doesn't have like one specific prototype uh, in the spiritual world, but it's like, so then the way you say, when you say astral, yeah, like you kind of create a body for something, like you create something in the material world, like we can all, like we can see parts of the thing in the material world, like we can see physical exchanges somewhere for the New York Stock Exchange, we can see people working for it, but like in terms of thinking about like spiritually what it is, and like what kind of, because the thing is about these kinds of things is that they have a kind of like agency over us, like, no, because when you make something like, yeah, a stock exchange, a company, like that thing, then like with a brand and everything about it, like then no one person kind of controls it, right? And you have to have, high level governance structures within that thing, right? And then you can have dynamics, you can have fights within internally about the thing, right? um like because one thing I talked to Jordan Hall about when I spoke with him is, imagine you have like a dynamic on, like, let's, zoomed out a bit, but even like a societal level, like you create something like money, or again, it's not really created. That's the thing, and the thing we talked about is like it's a reciprocal process where, like, at every step you can try and make money more complex. You can like say we're gonna have physical money now. We're gonna like start using double ledger accounting, da 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 da. But equally, like as you start using money, that kind of changes society, and it pushes society in certain ways, and then like when you keep using money, you can't like then just go, oh wait, we don't like this, it's not a good idea, let's go back. Like like it's a reciprocal thing, and you've like set up everything about it so that you can use money, so you can't go back. And the reason I bring that up is because when you think about these kinds of egregores as like a kind of collection of spirits, almost, or like a headless thing, it kind of makes me think that when humans, like, I'm not even being denigrative, but when we just in general, just like as a fact, when we create kind of technologies and we create high end like structures, these complex things that are not fully governed by the lower level parts, like the humans within it, you kind of like create a body that like spirits can kind of come in. And I'm using spirits, and I don't know what, like, even if I, if I even like believe or what that means in terms, but like I'm just using that word because, again, like with like personality, like anger, like if you set up the conditions in a person such that like you allow them to get angry, like at a certain point, like they can't help but just be super angry and lash out, and like, and it becomes less personal. And then similarly, like on a collective level, like when me and John Hall talk about like the god Mammon or something, and like invoking that to explain money, like I don't think money equals Mammon. I don't know, because I don't know what that would mean. Like money isn't a thing, but like equally, you kind of do let in like agencies that it might make sense to think of as like a person, like in some way personal, in certain sense. I guess that's what like the Bible might use these kinds of words. So that's just how I'm thinking about it. Is, yeah, like a collection of spiritual entities could make use of the things that we make here on Earth, if that makes sense.
100%. And that's that's the classical example of demonic possession that you're referring to. Basically, you know,
Right.
you read in the Bible that things like how Mary Magdalene had been filled with 7 demons, right? And Christ rid her of these demons. Um, Obviously, there's a heavily symbolic quality to that, but also one also has to deal with the concrete, sort of facts on the ground of the demons inhabiting Mary Magdalene, right? Like we also want to look at the face value of the text as well. Um, and when something beyond your personhood enters into the mixture of entities that you have kind of constellated around you, it diminishes your personhood, right? It diminishes your ability to exercise your personal freedom, um, and it renders you more animalistic, right? I mean, that this is the when you hear the church fathers talk about the difference between the flesh and the spirit, it's often done in this context of sort of animalistic behavior versus truly proper human behavior. True proper human behavior is behavior which is oriented beyond the mere animal level, right? Because animals just again, animals have this, if we want to use the term again, astral body, They have a kind of astral body that's more or less common to every single animal, and they're just those passions and drives and proclivities and urges. They just enter into the animal, and the animal has no freedom to counteract that, right? um,
it,
and so
it
when we act similarly to animals, we're diminishing, denigrating our personhood to a certain extent.
it's because this makes me think of Carl Jung and the way he thinks about the ego uh, within the self, like so, like as this sort of like pin and this point within this huge amount of unconscious, the which is probably greater than the conscious ego thing that we say. I'm this person, I'm Jack, and so. But the thing is that there's also like, so even though the way in a way the ego is actually small compared to all the unconscious forces that drive us, right? You just think about in your individual life, you couldn't work without all the unconscious habits and everything that works for you. It's just way too, the thing about it from a cognitive science perspective, it's way too intensive, like energetically, computationally. You couldn't actually like think through every single problem. So like by definition, you're gonna have drives and systems working without your control. But nevertheless, there's a kind of responsibility, a moral responsibility of the ego. Carl Jung would say. So even though it's in a way kind of small, in a way it's not. It's super important because yeah, like it's something which can bind all those unconscious drives and things kind of together, and make something kind of unified. Um, and I like that because I remember Jonathan Peugeot talking about addiction, and you bring up demonic possession, and like he kind of, for him the spiritual language is like active in his mind and fine, and like he wants to use it, and it kind of makes sense, right? Imagine people go through addiction and things like this. The way he described it is, you kind of often see that like there are these like cycles where like you kind of go a certain way, but then it's also tugging at you, right? And like you have as you go further down addiction or like um bad habits, that reduces your agency and makes things even worse, right? Um, and like, I kind of then, as I say this, I want to bring in like a John Vervaeke, like Mark Lewis perspective on reciprocal narrowing. Do you need to bring in spirits? Like, is this not just like something that we can describe through pure psychology of just, yeah, it makes sense that as you reduce your agency, that means you can solve problems even worse in a reciprocal cycle, and but like, again, as we've been talking about, it kind of does make sense to think about these kind of personalities, unconscious drives, as something real, non-reducible. So yeah.
Yeah,
I don't know if
exactly.
you have anything. Yeah, and so you might have anything to add there. um but I wonder then, like, to bring it
Well,
back
I
to
was no,
egregores and
I was thinking of something as you were talking there. So
mhm,
it's really, I think some people sometimes get the wrong idea of what this separation between the flesh and the spirit is, right? Like the difference between strictly animal behavior and human behavior. It's not that you want to completely get rid of your drives and passions. You're just trying to subjugate them to the higher part of your being, right? So you want to just take them. They're not going to go away. You're not going to get rid of those animalistic elements of your nature. You are, in a certain sense, an animal always. You're just trying to, well, a a a Christian, let's say, is trying to transform those base proclivities and drives and urges into virtues, right? It's transforming. It's not uh, doing away with or completely discarding, right? We don't want to sever the flesh from the spirit. We want to subjugate the flesh to the spirit. That's the point. So
mm. No, okay. Oh, thank you. That's it's really interesting. And then like a final thing on there on egregores is, um we started the discussion kind of talking about the fact that someone like Jonathan Peugeot wants to talk about higher agencies, but then you also have people steeped in science, scientists like John Vervaeke, wanting to speak about, just use, can we use some way, like some terminology to speak about distributed cognition, right? Because if we just start thinking about these things as like on the individual basis, it doesn't make sense. Like, do you have anything more to say, even, or just even like into the future? Like, do you think these debates will be more important? Like, trying to think about like spiritually what, and like just in general how to think about these kind of high agencies.
Mm. Perhaps what I would say is that the the shackles of materialism are very, very tight and very, very difficult to rid oneself of and to break free of. And I find that even in these conversations where people are taking recourse um, in concepts like egregores, demons, angels, what have you, there's still a tendency to devolve into materialism. And I think it takes a lot of effort to completely distance oneself from materialistic ways of thinking. And so, what I would hope to see in these conversations moving forward is a real acceptance of these spiritual realities um, that moves beyond just the hey, isn't this cool? Um, how does one arrive at that point? You know, Jonathan Pajot would tell you go to church. I'm not going to necessarily say that, although I think that's probably a good idea. I don't know. I don't know the solution. Um, all I know is that if one really wants to arrive at an understanding of spiritual realities, one has to, at a certain point, refuse to map corruptible patterns onto what is incorruptible, right? Onto what is more permanent. Our minds are just shot through with um, corruptible ways of thinking. And what I mean by that is just material thinking in terms of that which is dead and dying, right? Because everything around us in this physical world is dead and dying to a certain extent, and that death and that decay seeps into our thought process, our thought processes, and seeps into the very part of our cognitive faculties which would otherwise lead us away from death and decay. Our conceptual life is supposed to be, or has the potential to be, the conduit to spiritual apprehension, right? This is a Steinerian point that I'm making here. The it's a profound irony that we have developed such a rarefied thought life in contemporary culture. It's so incorporeal, right? But does incorporeal mean spiritual? Not necessarily, right? So we are at this moment in time where our concepts are so thin, our concepts are so detached from material, from physicality, from minerality, so to say. But at the same time, they are shot through with the residues of material thinking and death and decay. So it's this weird thing. We're faced with this weird conundrum in contemporary culture where we've got the tools and we're at the point where we could really take a step into truly apprehending and accepting spiritual realities. But we are kind of in a certain sense refusing to take the plunge, right? We insist on tethering our conceptual world, our conceptual life, to what is dead and dying. And so I guess I would just my hope is that we can move forward into a more spiritualized modality of exploring these things.
And you have an article on AI and sort of the Narcissus myth of like, kind of it's a kind of, because AI is kind of the way you train it. It's us. It's the things that we've created, and then we train it on that. And then like you have, um, like the Apple CEO, or whatever, giving a speech about we'll make a new AI like God, and then we can, if it's so intelligent, it'll like solve all our problems, and like, no doubt there'll be some kinds of intelligences within like these AI. Like it's something Jonathan Pajot and Jordan Peterson have talked a lot about, of like, we don't understand what kind of things are within the AI. Like you train them, but then like what kind of personalities do they have? What kind of uh, like patterns kind of they're unrevealed, right? So it's like if we don't kind of take into account these kind of realities, then you can think that you're creating something new or so amazing, but again, you're more maybe even just creating a body for like existing spiritual kind of realities, and you just like don't know what you're playing with, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, that's
Well, to take it back to egregores, I mean, we're creating what we're creating is really an astral entity of a sort, right? The contemporary, our modern world, our modern landscape is a sprawling assemblage of incredibly intricate and interwoven and complex mechanical apparatuses into which we project uh, the contents, a phantom of the contents of our psyche, right? In hopes of, I don't know, what are we hoping to create? Some people think that we're going to engender consciousness, right? I think that's absurd. Um, but yeah, we're placing our hopes in a strange reflection of our soul life, of our um, quite chaotic and disturbed soul life, right? And we're hoping that it's going to be the solution to our problems. And like you said, with with things like the economy, there's no turning back from that. Once these things become integrated and interwoven into the structure of our society and our culture, we have no choice but to you know go along with those things to some degree. And it's just what it's going to require is just an increased sort of spiritual fortitude, I would say, right? Uh, I'm not the kind of person. You got folks like Paul Kingsnorth, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but this sort of rewilding movement, right, within Christianity, where people are talking about going back into the woods and adopting primitive practices, and it's this sort of reactionary anti-modern stance. I respect that 100%, and I think that's going to be a viable option for certain people. But to a certain extent, you got to make use um, of what's given, and increasingly, what's given is this strange egregore that is emerging in the AI space, and yeah, it's a strange thing indeed.
yeah. And I don't think like maybe these technologies and these kind of things we're creating are not inherently bad, but it's like I remember the Lords of Spirits podcast, and the Church Fathers, they're talking about technology, and how God would allow us to have more technology if only we were sort of spiritually more uh there attuned, so like there could be a way to manage these kinds of things, and like or as Jonathan Peugeot would say, like the New Jerusalem, whatever, would be like it'll be a technological, right? It'll be a city, and that's like not a bad thing, but it's kind of uh you need to perhaps, a thought, a hypothesis, you need to have the spiritual kind of attitude and in right relations in order to be able to sort of live in that.
I mean, yeah, exactly. It's technology is not inherently bad. It's never inherently bad. There's good things and bad things that can be done with all technology. It just so happens to be that this particular technology that we are engendering today has potentially the most disastrous potential for us as a species, uh, more so than anything we've ever encountered before. And it's because it's striking at the very thing that defines our personhood, that defines us as human beings. It's taking shots at our creativity, right? So if I was watching a video by this musician, uh, YouTuber Rick Beato. He does a lot of. He's very very popular. He is a basically a music critic, a really really interesting YouTuber, and he's been sounding the alarm on AI, the usage of AI within music and music production for quite some time. And in a recent video, he imagines a future where the individual person will kind of create the music playlist that they want to hear. They will create the songs that they want to hear, quote unquote, create by entering in certain prompts to AI. Um, and so the kind of picture that brought up in my mind was this world where human beings think that they're being creative when really they're offloading their creative capacities to a completely dead mechanism, right?
Mm,
And what they're doing is they're just fueling their passions and their drives into this machine that's pumping back reflections of their psyche at them, and they think that that's liberating and great. It has the potential to be liberating and great as long as you can uh, not allow those mechanisms to erode at your personhood and at your ability to cultivate virtue, your ability to transform your lower passions into virtues, right? But it becomes harder and harder and harder the more you offload your creative, your ability to leverage your freedom as a human person to mechanical entities, right? So again, it's not a bad thing in and of itself. It just means that human beings have to become stronger to in the face of these technologies. How do you become stronger? I think the answer is a spiritual and probably a religious one. That's just from my perspective as a as
mm.
a as a Christian. But
It's yeah, it's so interesting that you'd say that, bring up that technology can kind of act as kind of, yeah, like it's almost like a just self-aggrandizing. Like you, as you say, like if you were to create your own music just by prompts, and it's like just purely what you like, it's like pure idiosyncrasy. um um it makes me think, like, just in general, the way I see myself using my phone or other people, like you can constantly send messages, you can constantly do whatever you want, you can create music, you can create like, playlists, anything you want. And it's like cool, like if you can think about any song in your head and then you can go and listen to that. But on the other hand, like I even personally, like, kind of, I'm sometimes wary when I start like listening to like any song I want in random orders, rather than, I don't know, like the fact that albums are created, as albums. um then, like, because it kind of feels incoherent for me, and then it's like kind of devalues even what like music is. And I don't want to like um tell people how, because I listen to music, because that's, I'm saying it's what I do. But like equally, um for example, like my phone broke recently and I just didn't replace it, and I just have a worse phone I barely use. And I actually like that. I like that I have a worse phone, because then I don't use it as much. And then you realize, like, this stuff that that's going through your unconscious. Maybe you should just like deal with that first, rather than like just constant stimulus. But yeah, that's what it makes me think about.
yeah, it's going to
Awesome.
get harder and harder.
um, you have a cool Substack that you write. Just tell me about where people can find you. Because this has been a
Yeah,
great
so
podcast.
so my the name of my Substack is very boring. It's just my name. It's Kenneth Michael Florence. I have a website. You can visit it. It's kennethmichaelflorence.com, and on it you'll find kind of what I'm up to musically. I have a whole separate life where I make music. It's rock music. It's singer songwriter kind of music. I'm also a classical composer, quote unquote classical, whatever that means these days. So you can find all the different nooks and crannies and avenues of my work on my website. So
Awesome. Thank you.